Hey everyone, welcome back to PS Platypus. Today we're going to be having a look at some farm and looking at the Parkinson's drugs. This is going to be a very quick overview of them. Basically, all you really have to know for the exams and understand for being able to answer the MCQ questions. So let's get started. In terms of what we'll be covering today, we're going to talk about a bit about the pathophys of Parkinson's very briefly. Essentially, the main idea here is there's reduced dopamine activity and therefore reduced signaling overall in the brain, which causes Parkinson's motor and psychological symptoms. And in terms of treatment, we'll talk about all the different treatments that exist. So we have treatments that increase dopamine release, treatments that are agonists for dopamine receptors, and then treatments that also prevent the breakdown of dopamine. And we'll talk about what they are and some of the side effects of all of them as well. Muscarinic antagonists and something called amantadine at the end as well. So pathophys wise, we don't really know what causes sort of primary Parkinson's, but there's something called Parkinsonism where certain drugs can actually lead to Parkinson symptoms and things like anti-dopaminergic drugs, right? And you can have a look at them as well. So pathophys wise, loss of dopaminergic neurons in primary Parkinson's normally occurs in the substantia nigra. That's a pretty important sort of term to keep in mind because it pops up quite a bit everywhere. It's an anatomical location where you normally have quite a bit of dopaminergic neurons, but because they're lost, you actually lose the dark pigmentation of the area because less dopamine is being released in what's called the nigrostriatal pathway, which is responsible for your movements, and therefore you have hypokinesia because you have less ability to initiate and result in movements. So the main thing is less dopamine equals less movement, right? Hypokinesia. Clinically, there's a lot of things that go on, but it's easy to remember it with a nice little mnemonic, and the one that's commonly taught is TRAP. So that's tremors, and that's pill rolling tremors specifically. So that's the first T. R, rigidity, and it's often called cogwheel rigidity, and that usually occurs unilaterally. So it starts off in one arm and then affects both. And you also have akinesia, which is another way for saying you have reduced movements or no movements in the worst case, but also bradykinesia is more common where you have reduced ability to move, right? And postural instability, and classically the phrase used there is a stooped posture. And the rest of it is down there as well. You have a mask-like face because you can't really move your face muscles either. Micrographia, dysphagia, so like you have really small handwriting and difficulties with speaking and swallowing, sorry, depression, cognitive issues, constipation, sexual dysfunction, all sort of within the domain of Parkinson's. I hope that also makes sense. And now we come to the treatments. So the treatments, there's quite a few, but we'll sort of focus on what you really have to know. So the first one we'll talk about is your levodopa and carbidopa, which are two drugs that are going to help increase dopamine release in the brain. And the way it works is levodopa is a precursor so it's L-DOPA, precursor to L-DOPA, and it can cross the blood-brain barrier, right? So it crosses over, and whatever remaining CNS neurons you have, because remember the neurons are being lost, the dopaminergic neurons are dying, there are going to be some left over. They can use the dopa decarboxylase, which is an enzyme within them, to convert the L-DOPA or levodopa into dopamine, and then therefore you have more dopamine, and you can fix the core pathophysiology causing the Parkinson's. However, the reason we add on that carbidopa is because that is a peripheral decarboxylase inhibitor. So we have dopa decarboxylase in our brains. We also unfortunately have it in other peripheral sites as well outside the brain. And that's going to convert the levodopa in sites outside the brain. The reason that's a bit of an issue is that if we end up converting all the L-DOPA outside the brain, less of it's going to actually reach and be converted inside the brain because the converted form can't cross the blood-brain barrier. So that's why we use the carbidopa to prevent it being converted outside the brain and then keep it in its L-DOPA form so it can cross over into the blood-brain barrier. And there it'll be converted and be more effective at increasing dopamine levels and therefore reducing the symptoms of Parkinson's. Side effects, basically the idea here is if you take too much of it or like give too much of a dose initially, you can have dyskinesia where you have, sort of or hyperkinesia where you have uncontrolled movements. And that's because it's pretty much too effective. And the way you fix that is sort of adjusting the dose until you have a good amount that's going to reduce symptoms, but also not cause those dyskinesias. We also have dopamine receptor antagonists as our next one to look at. We have pramipexole here and bromocriptine, only the pramipexoles on your eFarm website. Bromocriptine also is important to keep in mind as well, because one of the things that it's got associated with it is actually gambling. We'll come to that in a second. Essentially, these are dopamine receptor agonists. So they bind to the D2 receptors and reduce Parkinsonian symptoms. However, they can also bind to peripheral D2 receptors and therefore cause things like nausea and hypertension, and also mania as well. And the bromocriptine is associated with gambling addiction or gambling behavior as well, which is a bit of an interesting one to think about. Um, and that's those two drugs done. Next, we have our MAO-B inhibitors. And these are going to bind to an enzyme called monoamine oxidase B, acutely called MAO-B, and it inhibits them. And the one that you have to know from eFarm is it's legiline, but it's also resegiline as well. They both have the same mechanism of action. They bind to and inhibit this enzyme and prevent that enzyme from metabolizing and breaking down dopamine. Therefore, dopamine sort of sticks around and stays, and it's unmetabolized, put back into the vesicle so it can be released the next time rather than being broken down. Side effects, however, include insomnia and a headache. Then you have your COMT inhibitors, and these inhibit the COMT enzyme, and they prevent levodopa, the dopamine precursor, being metabolized again. So similar idea. So the precursor in this case is being prevented from metabolized, and therefore more of it can actually then go forward into use in converting into dopamine. So you're not breaking it down, you're converting it to dopamine. However, side effects, you have nausea and diarrhea here as well. And the example of this drug is entacapone, and that's those two. And then you finally have your muscarinic antagonists, your benztropine and amantadine. Amantadine is a bit of an interesting one because I think it's also an antiviral agent, but benztropine essentially is a muscarinic antagonist. So the idea here is dopaminergic neurons, they exert a inhibitory effect on cholinergic neurons, right? So in Parkinson's, that dopamine is downregulated because we have loss of dopamine, and there's less inhibition of cholinergic neurons, and you have more cholinergic activity, which might explain some of the extrapyramidal symptoms of Parkinson's, so the tremor. So these drugs are pretty good at controlling those extrapyramidal symptoms, and so helping reduce that tremor. These antagonists cross the blood-brain barrier and reduce the cholinergic activity, and therefore reduce some symptoms and provide some mild relief in the early stage, but they're not going to be as good as our levodopa and carbidopa. Those are sort of like your very, very effective measures for Parkinson's. Side effects of this is that because you're antagonizing muscarinic receptors, you're having an anticholinergic effect. So you have all your anti-sludge symptoms. And that's it for treatment. It's a very, very quick video. I know we've only spent a couple of minutes on it, but everything you need to know really is contained within these slides. Have a look at them, see if it all makes sense, put it all together and see if you can really sort of recall from a memory as well what each of the drugs do and how they work. The main thing I think which can be a bit startling to understand is a bit of the side effects, because some of them are not very expected. So if I go back here, actually, one thing I didn't cover is with MAO-B, inhibitors, they're really great. But some of the old inhibitors, so the MAO-A inhibitors, they weren't that great because they had something called the cheese reaction, which essentially is the idea that whenever you consume certain foods or even alcohol, and the foods include things like cheese, which is why you get called a cheese reaction, but those foods, they enter your gut and release tyramine, an amino acid, and normally it's broken down by the gastric MAO-A enzyme. But if you inhibit it with a MAO-A inhibitor, the tyramine builds up and you have that actually entering your blood and causing mass release of noradrenaline and leading to a hypertensive crisis, which is why MAO-A inhibitors weren't that great, but MAO-B is pretty good. So MAO-B is better because you don't have the cheese reaction. And that's all within the speaker notes as well. You can have a look at that there. So that's pretty much it for this slide set. If you have any questions about that, feel free to let me know. Otherwise, take a look, see if it all makes sense, and we'll see you in the next one.